Hey everybody, I'm Ginger Zumaeta, CEO of Motive3, and I'm here with an old friend. It's been like 20 years or so.
Yeah, you're
Um,
aging both of us.
I know it's crazy. Mike Smith. Mike is an executive coach, but has held so many positions, kind of getting to executive coach that we've been talking about story, Mike. We've talked about culture and story and brand, and I feel like your story should at least be part of what we talk about. So share how you arrived at this executive coach from when I knew you back in the day in Philly at NBC.
Wow. Well, thanks, Ginger. I'm super pumped today to share stories and I talked with you and your audience about that. Yeah, the Cliff Note version is I'm a lifetime sports and media finance person, first at Deloitte and NBC in Philadelphia, where you and I worked together at the NBC TV station, which, by the way, is an incredible way to get to know the media industry and business in general, working at a TV station. Moved from there to LA, where our paths crossed a little bit again when I was at NBC Studios and you were at the NBC West Coast entity. I then moved on to the National Football League, with first in finance role, and then pivoted to talent and HR roles, which is a story we'll probably get to as well. And ultimately at the NFL and formed my own firm, Huddle Advisory, focused on coaching leaders and teams really to realize their potential as a leadership athlete. One of the things that really came to me working 16 seasons at the NFL is that when people think about themselves as an athlete and they train like an athlete would train, they're going to be the best person they can be, and the results of the organization are going to be the best that they can possibly be. Yeah, leaders oftentimes they don't take the time to think about themselves as an athlete and really train like an athlete. But Tom Brady or Serena Williams or you name it, they view their training and their performance totally linked with one another. And I think that when we all think about ourselves that way, we're going to get the best versions of ourselves. So that's a little bit about who I am and how I got here.
So from finance to talent to executive coaching. Amazing.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so Mike, I think different people have different ideas about coaches and executive coaches. Can you just break down a little bit about your perspective on that?
Yeah. Well, I think when people think about, Bill Belichick or, Vince Lombardi or some of the famous coaches that exist in football or anywhere, it's about a guy or a gal that's got a clipboard and they're screaming and they're, putting up chalk on the chalkboard, designing plays and really sharing their expertise and trying to get the athletes to do a specific thing or run a certain play. Executive coaching is a little bit different because what executive coaching is about is creating a tailored process for an individual where it's going to be goal oriented, it's going to be focused on behaviors and results, but it's going to be really guiding that leader to the answer that is best for that leader. I certainly draw on a lot of experience and a lot of expertise in order to guide someone, but oftentimes a coach is going to be leading with questions as opposed to leading with answers in order to get the best results. And I think what coaches find is oftentimes the answer is really within the person, and the coach's job is to help them hold a mirror up to themselves, help them create self-awareness, um, help them think through options, help them think through cost benefits of different approaches, and really just create, at its core, a safe space for a leader or a client or a team to have a conversation where, it's the one meeting during the week where you get to take your armor off and be as authentic as you can possibly be. And that's what coaching provides, is that haven for a leader just to really think through situations and what the best course of action needs to be. So sometimes there's advisory work and sometimes there's a message of, hey, I saw this before and here's probably the approach you want to take. Many, many more times it's about what's in front of you? What have you thought about? How have you contributed to this situation? What's happening at a macro level? And what are the options before us? And what are the trade-offs of pursuing each option?
So, it's funny, I've been talking to a lot of, you know, interestingly, I've been talking to a lot of kind of like different variations of coaches lately. Um, and coaches that are kind of going in at an organizational level, and I talking about culture, and I know we're going to get to that. And then folks that are coaching individuals, and what I'm sort of curious about is, and I'm gonna be a little selfish here, that what's the interplay of, when I think of a coach, and I've had coaches in the past, my request to a coach is always like, listen, I'm not looking for an armchair psychologist. you know I'm looking for someone who is going to hold me accountable, show me my blind spots, help me improve in the areas that, I haven't thought of already. Now, granted, I'm not saying that's the right way, because I think what I find often is, after you develop that relationship, it does actually go much more inward in terms of like, what am I working on that's kind of manifesting outward. But I would imagine also your background in finance and talent prior to to zeroing in on executive coaching, is also part of the canvas that you're kind of bringing to folks. Does that make you do it in a slightly different way, or do you have a slightly different lens when you think about bringing your skill set to a leader?
I certainly hope so. And I think, just to also loop back to your question, my background as being both a finance leader and CFO and an HR leader and a CHRO, I think does give me an absolutely unique perspective to try to align a business problem and how do we solve it with a talent solution, or a talent solution and a business problem, or vice versa. And so I do think that I having that background just gives me a lens to look at things that ultimately is the most practical, most straightforward thing that gets to the result that the leader is looking for. But just to whip back around to your own personal experience with this, I think where I come out is every coach should just be meeting the client where they are, and everybody's different. And I'm quite sure that there's a million great coaches that have a different approach than I do, but recognizing that you're wired a certain way. You entered coaching because you have specific things that you're trying to improve upon, or challenges that you're trying to wrestle down, and working with a client to create a tailored, customized way that you work. I would say that coaching is not therapy, of course. It's not even consulting. It's not even being a mentor, at least not all the time. And it shouldn't be all the time. It is about, you entered this relationship with coaching to accomplish X, Y, and Z. And my job is to help guide you getting there. But sometimes progress is not a straight line. And so there's going to be times where a person comes into a session and they were supposed to experiment with a different conversation technique, or supposed to hold a one-on-one meeting and a different agenda, or whatever the tactic could have been. But right before the meeting with the coach, their boss just got into them on something that was incredibly unfair, and it was really John or Sally's fault. And all they need to do is just unpack what the heck just happened. And that's what we're going to do for the hour, because that's what the client needs in that moment. And we'll certainly try to land the plane in a way that's the most productive way forward, and try to refocus them on what their game plan is, or at least incorporate where the game plan elements could have been used in a different way, or how to think about it going forward. But I do think that the relationship that a client has with a coach, Rome's not built in a day, but over time, it's a really trusting relationship. And what I've heard clients share is that, again, it's probably the most authentic version of a person that someone gets to be. If we think about, Ginger or Mike, there's many versions of us, and all of them are in some ways authentic. You're different with work colleagues versus friends versus families versus spouses, partners, what have you. But when you're in a very trusting and healthy coaching relationship, all those different dynamics come into play, and you get a person that is at its core who they really are and what they're trying to solve, and really ultimately who they're trying to become. And that what is needed as a solution in a session just may be different from one session to another session, as long as we keep our eye on the ball of what the plan is and what the person wants to resolve and hopefully get improvement on.
Now, do you have like a specific profile of a person, either within a specific type of company or size of company, or is there a profile in terms of like they tend to have X, Y, and Z kind of pain points that they're trying to solve? Like how does your specific kind of approach line up with the market in terms of who you work best with, or who's finding that they work best with you?
Yeah, well, I think just from an industry perspective, I'm agnostic. In a stage of company perspective, startup or Fortune 500, I'm agnostic. I think leader level, C-suite, or on their way to there is probably more my sweet spot. Someone that is a little bit earlier in their experience probably is not the best fit for me. But what I tell people is that at its core, the most important thing is that they're coachable. And for me, that's about someone that's resilient, they're curious, they're honest, they're transparent. And I got that mostly from one of my favorite quotes, one of my favorite players of all time, Michael Jordan, the famous basketball player. He actually said that his greatest skill in life wasn't his talent, wasn't any God-given ability. It was the fact that he was coachable, is that he was always curious and willing to learn. And I share with people that, there's a guy that was, at the pinnacle of athleticism, obviously both something he worked at greatly, as well as some natural gifts. But, mid-stage of his career, he actually realized that other athletes were catching up to him and he needed to do something a little bit different. So he developed this back to the basket, mid-range, post-up game that really prolonged his career. And he recognized that he needed to change before someone else needed to. And the fact that he was coachable and willing to listen to feedback and experiment with things and put things into practice was admittedly, what he said was his greatest gift. And that always just struck with me, is that if a person really was coachable, really willing to look into the mirror, really willing to get feedback and hold themselves accountable and have just a desire to try something different in order to grow, then that's somebody I'm going to be drawn to. And that's typically, the thing that I really am most focused on when I'm vetting future clients, and the same with them.
So, that's great. I'm where that kind of leads me next to kind of be curious is, a leader is always a leader in a context, right? Like they've got a company or they've got a department or whatever, whatever that looks like for them. So how much of an interplay is that? You and I have been talking about culture, and so kind of that's what I'm stepping into is you can't be you in a vacuum. There's always your surroundings and the people around you that are sort of influencing how you act, react, behave, etc. And so talk to me a little bit about the leader inside the org.
Yeah, I think the org part of that is always more important, I think, than sometimes the individual person. One of the things I did that started during COVID and it just got done this past December is I went through a doctoral program at Vanderbilt to just get a lot more academic rigor around the things that I innately knew and developed while I was in the sports and media world. And one of the classes introduced me to this this management thinker named Edward Deming. So you're familiar with Six Sigma, the quality improvement initiative that GE and Motorola and all these companies initiated around how to get to near perfect processes in their manufacturing and other areas. And one of the real pioneers of that movement is this guy named Edward Deming. And he had this quote that really stuck with me, which is that every system is perfectly designed to get the result that it gets. So, and oftentimes, if not all the time, a really good person cannot defeat a bad system, that the bad system is going to swallow up the good person. And what that spoke to me is the fact that people can be really successful in one environment and not successful in another, and vice versa on that as well. And it speaks to this topic of culture, of course. And so, like, there's quotes, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and all this other stuff. But it also is this word that people sort of all know it, but if you ask 10 people how to describe culture in an organizational context, you probably would get 9 different answers out of the 10. And the best definition I ever heard for it is it's the way things work around here. Which I just love as a definition, because we know the way things work as a startup and frenetic, and everyone has wearing 10 hats and there's no process, is very different than the way things work at a nuclear power plant, where everything is regulated and people can only do X or Y, and everything has got super bureaucracy attached to it. And when I zoom out around culture and macro environment, in some ways, like, I was trying to think about it as a math equation, like what are all the elements that are involved that actually get to what a culture is? And there's many, but where I landed are, you've got values in an organization, so what it finds to be important, and what they state, and how those values are woven into all the decisions they make is one thing. There's all these unwritten rules and norms that organizations have that you don't know until you get a mentor at a place or onboarded. And that's, do meetings start on time, to, who speaks first, and, all these sort of things. Then there's all the visible behaviors that go on in terms of, is it collaborative? Is it really directive? Is things done in emails, whoever. Then there's rituals around, again, maybe the way meetings are run, or different things that go in the organization. And then there's all these visible symbols that are around us, in terms of dress code, or what the offices look like, or, whatever have you. And so you have all that going on that defines sort of what an organizational culture is, that a person and a leader is expected to operate in. And unless leaders are really intentional around culture, something else is going to happen, because we know the culture is going to take place and grow and just cement itself, whether a leader intentionally wants to or not actually engage. But if they don't engage, there's going to be a culture, just might not be the culture that is optimized for what the business is trying to do, or what the organization's purpose is. So again, I think it's just helpful to think about, if the end state we want in order to maximize people's performance is the right culture for the right place, let's think about what are the elements we need to be most focused on in order to build that.
That's interesting. It's funny. I would never have thought in a million years that I would be working on sort of company culture, right? Brand culture, branding, storytelling. Yes, that's sort of always been in my wheelhouse. But what we started to realize is, the more and more we went upstream to try to figure out, like, we've got to actually sell this brand, which I just look at in a way as selling a story, right? Getting buy-in to a story, getting participation in a story, and in many ways just getting people to understand the story of what we're up to. You said the way things work around here, and I'm often thinking about, like, what are we really up to around here? And I started finding that we just needed to get past the marketing department, right? Like, we needed to get to the CEO. We needed to get to the CHRO, right? Because even in terms of the people that the company is pulling in, to see, can we get everyone to buy in to this story of what we're up to? And if we can do that, things just get a lot easier. I mean, so I'm curious about, when you're working with leaders, I feel like a lot of what you do and what I do intersect in interesting ways.
Yeah, 100%. And I love your simple definition for a brand of what we're up to around here. I might actually, and once I use it 3 times, I might end up stealing that as my own thought, but at least the first couple, I'm going to credit you for that, because I do think I love the simplicity of defining things to have people wrap their head around, because that allows people also to interpret and sort of put their own handprint on it. It's funny when I think about culture and brand, my first thought goes to is they seem like they're totally interwoven with each other, in terms of what we're up to and the way things work around here are two things that are hand in hand. It's not necessarily one goes first and one goes second, but if you're not thinking about both sides, one is going to get weak, and that then ends up impacting the other, because you can imagine that if you've got a really strong culture and a really weak brand, over time, that really then impacts employee recruiting and some ways that you actually pull in the organization. And certainly if you have a really strong brand but a really weak culture, then ultimately that's going to impact retention and motivation and a whole bunch of other things. But sort of to blend that thought with what you said before about the environment, oftentimes when I work with a leader, what I end up doing is going to sports metaphors, not surprisingly. And one of my favorite football metaphors is this concept of an all 22 video. So if you know anything about football, or this is probably a simplistic way to describe it for your audience if they're not fans, is that when a coach or a player, when they're analyzing a game and reviewing the tape or scouting an opponent, it's incredibly rare, if it ever happens, of looking through just the quarterback's eyes or looking through just the linebacker's eyes or just focused on one aspect of the field. It's much more common that an all 22 video is used of looking at from a sky top view, all 11 offense, all 11 on defense, and how the interplay of that works with each other, and how a move by one player impacts another player, which causes a breakdown or an opportunity that ultimately gets encapsulated. And I think that as a metaphor is really helpful to get leaders to zoom out and not get focused on just their problems or just who their competitor is, their adversary or their boss, to really just see, what's going on here, that environmentally, politically, incentive-wise, whatever the issue that would cause different moves to be made that are then having downstream impacts on other moves. And I think that the other thing that is key to that is within that dynamic of when you're looking at something all 22 from up high, is that there's both a system thing going on where players are moving in relation to each other, but then there's also individual things going on. So every player, and just like every leader, has got their own motivation, their own perception, their own emotional state going on. There's all these things going on that are contributing to an inner work life that we unpack, and we try to make sure that we're seeing the field clearly and not sort of seeing through a fog. How are we seeing things objectively as possible? And there's a lot of stories we tell ourselves, during that process. Then at a leadership level, what's the coach doing or the captain of the team doing in order to set vision, or to make sure people are relating to each other, or make sure that people are able to tell them stories they need to tell in order to situate themselves and what their purpose and their role is. What's the leader's job there? And then you zoom out then at this cultural level, how do all these things come together so that the rituals and norms and behaviors and values actually are synergized with everything else, so that the end product of the culture is what you want it to be. So again, it's complicated, and it's not, once you recognize that there are specific elements that you need to unpack in order to figure out what the end goal is you want from a cultural standpoint.
So I'm going to kind of bring this into part of what I do. So I have a thesis that reality is created in communication, right? Like, I mean, we communicate, and it's more than verbal, by the way. You talked about norms, you talked about behaviors, you talked about values. We communicate those individually and collectively all the time, right? And so part of the reason I think that messaging and the words you use, and the way that you communicate is so important, is because what you say is going to affect what happens and what the behaviors are. And you talked about how you talked about these sort of ingredients that kind of interplay together to create culture. The first one that you said was values, and then you talked about norms and visible behaviors, rituals, visible symbols, which I love all of those. And one of the things that we find all the time is that I think something's missing in sort of, at least from the brand perspective, in terms of like the key corporate docs, right? There's usually some version of a mission, vision, and values, right? And then there's usually, once you get to a certain size company, either a very lean or sometimes more robust book on like, this is the brand book, right? And a lot of times that has to deal with identity. It's really like the logo, the typography, how you can interplay these things together. And the big thing that we see that's missing, and we used to think of it really as more of like a marketing based document. We're starting to think of it as a whole company document, is a messaging playbook, right? Because how do you take the mission, vision, and values and the brand, but then express it consistently inside the company and outside the company? And so I'm sort of tying together this idea of your all 22, which I had no idea about. I love it. I like having those 11 players on each side, but those 11 players, they need some guidelines in terms of what they're doing out there, and for me, that's the playbook. Like, how are we going to communicate to each other? I think the metaphor really works, because if you don't have a set of if you don't have at least a core narrative that everybody's on board with, for example, our end goal is over there, right? Like, we're all going that way, like it's going to be chaos. And we see that with companies all the time. A lot of times, if they're not expressing things really well externally, it's because they're not doing it internally either.
No. And I think someone had said, I don't know the source of it, I just know I'm not going to take credit for it, is that leadership is about being the storyteller in chief, and taking advantage of how you create a narrative when you create a vision. How are you the sense maker for people, so people can interpret what you're saying and then create their own meaning about their experience, and creating an environment where people relate to each other and form connections so you can build that community. And so thinking about, if I'm a leader, thinking about my own role of being that chief storyteller in order to create that platform internally, then gives people, I think, the space also then to lean into that rising to the top for them in whatever their role is, on the brand side or on the HR side or finance or analytics, whatever. But what you said something before, I just want to go back to, because I thought it was really, really aligned with something that I think about a lot, is that, what we say reinforces how we think. And there is a fair amount of science behind that. We only take in a finite amount of data that's available to us. So if you and I were both watching the same scene on a street, we both would take in different pieces of data of what we're seeing. Then we add meaning to it, we form assumptions, we draw conclusions, it then reinforces our beliefs about something, and then we take action on something, and that action is either doing something, saying something. And again, when we find ourselves doing something or saying something, it then reinforces the place we started of what things we selected in the first place. And I think at that individual level, where again, all corporate messaging and all leadership message starts with a person sort of thinking and analyzing, the more we are aware that that filtering is going on in everything we do, and challenging ourselves to go through an activity where we really reflect on it and try to analyze what we're missing, allows us just to get to better answers when we actually get to the messaging side. Because I forget the quote you said, reality is
In language.
right. So a quote I heard linked to that is, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And so I think, again, recognizing that we are going to be someone that's viewing any situation, any business problem, any marketing challenge, any brand development through a lens of our own emotions, our own perceptions, our own motivations, our own experiences, what just happened to us on the way to work in the morning, whatever the case is just going to allow us to get to a more objectively right version of the message that we're striving for.
Yeah, and you said something I think that's really important is I think as we as we go through life, our experience shapes the stories that we tell ourselves, right? And those tend to be like, that's right, because we experienced it, right? So therefore it's true. Meanwhile, everybody else is having their experiences. And so you said, there's really a need to be intentional about what you're expressing. And, I'm just kind of curious about, how often do you see when you're doing your coaching that, the leader needs a story or hasn't quite shaped their intentional story, right? Like, this is my intentional story so that it can start to ripple out. And, we have a way that we do that, through messaging. It's not the individual coaching. It's really, we're trying to tell the organization's story. But how often do you run across that where it's like, we're still trying to find the narrative here, and once we can kind of lock it down, do you find that makes things easier?
For sure. And oftentimes, when leaders don't really know where to start, or really maybe they're struggling for exactly what the bullseye is on this, I oftentimes encourage them to just start getting feedback and asking advice from folks around how to go about doing that. And especially the more senior leader, oftentimes that creates some vulnerability that might make somebody a little bit uncomfortable. But a leader demonstrating that kind of vulnerability also creates just an environment of psychological safety where people ultimately are going to feel more free to make a mistake and take a risk and not feel like they're going to get hammered over it. But asking others, what they think, asking others for advice actually is a secret sign of power, that you feel confident enough to actually seek someone else's feedback. But to your point, I think exposing your thinking and making your thinking transparent around what you're thinking about, why you're thinking about it, what options you've excluded, and getting other people's perspective and just get data in order to help shape the opinion is something I oftentimes have leaders think about. And I also, again, depends on the situation, because you don't always have this luxury. I'm a big fail fast kind of person. Let's experiment with something, test and refine, and see what's working. And so, creating a space where you can have some safe failures along the way as you're honing that message, I think is critical in order to ultimately land on something that a leader is going to find the most impactful and most comfortable.
It's funny, you mentioned outside perspective, and I'm gonna throw in a little story here. Actually, one of the things I learned back in my NBC days, I don't remember who said it, but there was some, poet, author, or somebody way back when that says, it was something along the lines, I'm going to get the quote wrong, but it was something like, I can't hear what you're saying. You're speaking so loudly with kind of everything else that you're saying. But in terms of the outside perspective, it reminds me, like, so just, God, I think it was last week. So just last week, we're doing a workshop with a company. And, we have a process, we kind of start with like, okay, well, what category of business are you in? And we work our way closer and closer to, we're trying to pull out, how this combination of things that they have, the product or service, and things that they do, kind of result in unique benefits to a buyer. But one of the questions we asked that I think they weren't expecting, but it ended up, revealing all of this gold. We were like, okay, well, so these are the logical benefits. Like, what are the psychological benefits that you're providing to the buyer? And that ended up taking us like on this journey where they kind of realized, like, oh my God, like the reason these people keep coming back to us, and then when they go to the next company, they hire us there, and then they refer everybody, is like, it's actually because of all the psychological benefits that we're giving them, not just the kind of service
So
level
interesting.
kind of product benefits. And you know, I mean, so much so that they came back to me this week and they're like, okay, we need like some psychology 101. Like we hadn't even thought about that. Now we want to get smart about it. But I think that's also, you know, there's something also to like someone else reflecting back to you what they hear. You know, we were very similar to you, like you know, how do you ask the right questions that maybe bubble something up that has kind of gone unseen. And you know, a lot of times, you know, we always say like you really only need one key insight to build a
Yeah.
business off, right? Like, and if you can find that, and it really is, I think, similar to what you do. It's for us, it's through inquiry, right?
Yeah.
We're trying to kind of pull things out to say, like, okay, no, that's new, that's novel, that's different. You're doing it in a way that you don't even realize, you know, that's kind of why you've been able to get where you are. Imagine what would happen if you kind of double down on that.
Yeah. And your idea of like sort of how to ask the question, I think is so on point, because oftentimes when I work with a leader or working with, you know, getting the 360 feedback myself, if I go through that process, I'll ask a similar question like 3 different ways, just at different altitudes or from different angles, because oftentimes people don't intuitively know what it is that they feel or want to say until you ask a key question that's going to unlock it. And as you're reflecting on the workshop you ran, it caused me to think about, you know, there was a leader I worked with who values off the charts, intellect off the charts, a self-professed servant leader, someone that loved sort of helping the team and loved actually being someone that they could rely on, you know, as a resource. And the results were good, just not great. And the engagement scores were good. Like everyone was sort of happy, but the desire was to actually get the results from good to great. And so to just find out, okay, well, how are we getting there? Because there's a lot of our metrics are actually pretty solid. So what's going on here? And through that inquiry process, again, it's thinking about how sometimes your strength ends up becoming a blind spot and getting in your way. The leader was becoming such a servant leader, so empathetic for their team, so trying to really just move at a speed and sort of jumping in with answers in order to try to help everybody out, that it was unintentionally undermining sort of everyone around him and causing everyone to retreat a little bit. And that it was just sub-optimized in every way. And if you think about a system-wide effect across, you know, an all 22 view of this, starting with the most important position at the CEO, what happens? And that was something that intuitively, the people I spoke with, it didn't come to them naturally right away that was sort of the issue. It came from having to really unpack different situations and understand what move was made, what counter move was made, what the result, and then linking that together. And once I went to the leader with, here's the feedback, and holding up the mirror is, you're actually not empowering them. And of course, the reaction is, what? Of course I am. You know, you should see the ways that I'm focused on them. And it's the yes, and yes, you're doing all that. And the impact of that is them behaving in a way that's probably not in the best interest of the organization. So once we figure out a new way for him to speak last at meetings, him to, you know, again, lead with questions, not lead with answers, him to sacrifice some degree of speed of execution in order to develop capacity within his team, which ultimately developed capacity in himself. It not soon after, the results improved and they started to move much closer to the great category that they're looking for by unlocking some system inefficiency that was existing. And I think it all comes from an ability or a desire to look in the mirror, ask yourself hard questions, go seek the data, and then actually do something with the data and try something differently and seeing what sticks and then refining from there.
So I'm curious, do you think that a leader can look themselves in the mirror, or do you think someone has to show them the mirror?
I think, listen, it's always helpful to have someone show them a mirror, and that's why there is such a thing as a coaching profession, but I do think that people can do this on their own if they don't have access to a coach for a reason. I always tell people that with the first thing that I would start in order to building self-awareness is set up a routine and a structure of talking to people, having coffees, and just finding out feedback, or if people aren't comfortable asking for feedback, ask for advice is another popular way to frame the question. Everyone's willing to ask it to give advice. Everyone loves having their opinion sought. Depending upon different organizational cultures, people feel sometimes less safe doing that. So you have to move people in that direction in a way that feels comfortable to them and is culturally appropriate. But I absolutely think that you can do this on your own if you set up a very systematized way of actually talking with people and getting data.
So I know one of the things that, since we've both been around the block a couple times, and different blocks, one of the things I don't always realize that, but I kind of have intuitively is, pattern recognition. When you're doing something, in different industries at different levels, like you are, with different kind of, issues that you see, you start to spot patterns. It's actually, I think, one of the great things about like being in the consulting profession is that you can see these things across, many different industries, and, see something that's really useful in one that isn't being used at all in another. And you're like, hey, let's do this. And so I'm curious about when you are coaching, you said you're working with, it's industry agnostic. It kind of, size isn't really an issue either. It could be, a fast growing startup. It could be Fortune 500. But what are some, for the folks listening, like what are some common things that maybe they should, where common pain points you see that they might recognize in themselves, that might be a place to start to kind of, scratch and see if there's something under there that they can look into.
Yeah, well, I think if I sort of stick to the individual team and sort of organizational lens, there's going to be a thing. There's probably a top three for each, but I'll just pick on one for each of them. At the individual level, I always start with, show me your calendar. How you're spending your time is who you are and what your priorities are. And I would say almost unanimously that leaders don't dedicate literally non-negotiable, the most important time in their calendar for self-reflection and strategic planning. That if you were to poll leaders, 97% would say that the most important thing they need to do is strategic planning, and about 98% would say they don't have enough time to do strategic planning. So I think at a minimum, it starts with, let's have non-negotiable dedicated time, Friday mornings, Monday afternoons, Sunday mornings, whatever, to review your week and plan ahead, and sort of really think about what's going on, and how do I need to show up, and is there any pattern recognition that's going on, or have I really sought data, or have I had a conversation with Sally, in the last 3 months, thinking about sort of that. So at an individual level, I would start with my calendar and just make sure that I've got time for myself. And that goes a long way towards just guiding you to look in the mirror. And again, there's, more things that go along with that.
Before you go to the next one, I want to kind of pull a thread there a little bit. So
Yeah.
let's say I'm looking at my calendar, which my calendar is a total shit show. I mean, it's like, it's
Do you want to
crazy.
pull it up right now, Ginger, on the YouTube?
No, I'm too embarrassed. Hold on. I mean, I could do it, but it's got a lot of, it's actually a lot like, plus you'd see pickleball in way too many places, but which is a good thing, I think. But, so they're looking at the calendar, they see a bunch of things. I think I'm halfway to your looking at my calendar, which I did finally start like color coding things in terms of like, this is client work and this is strategy. And I had to put one, and this is a part of it, like I realized I wasn't actually talking to outsiders enough. So now I have a bucket that's like talking to outsiders. Like, let me get outside of my office and actually have some conversation with more than just clients. But let's say I look at it and I realize, whoa, I am kind of just buried in the work associated with work, right? There's a new book by the guy that did Deep Work that he's now pushing like being much slower and intentional. And we spend a lot of times just organizing the work and setting up the work and reporting on the work, and sometimes it's like the work gets the thinnest slice. So if you recognize that I'm not actually spending enough time on strategic planning and on kind of like my vision and long range goals, like what does that look like for a leader? Like, is it 90 minutes looking at your checking out what are your big rocks that you're trying to accomplish and what am I doing? Like, just give me a little bit more in terms of like what does that actually look like?
Well, I think it is going to look different, but an example of what it could look like is, let's start with what are your personal and business goals that you're trying to accomplish, and what's the progress being made on those goals? How am I allocating my time? Some version of what you're doing, I think, is appropriate. But then also, I think asking yourself tougher questions of, are we being aggressive enough? Am I sort of analyzing my talent as the way that I need to? Am I settling for anything that I shouldn't be settling for? What are the things that we're not getting to, or that we have deprioritized because there's a shiny new toy came in, and is that the right decision, and how did that actually take place? So I think it could look a lot of different ways for a lot of different people based on what your real pain point is. And not every leader can devote 90 minutes. I just give me 30 minutes to start, and we'll start seeing the impact from that. But oftentimes the feedback I get is not necessarily how to structure the 30 minutes or 90 minutes, it's just where that it comes from. And I think trying to wring efficiency in a person's calendar by really analyzing, there's a great tool called the Eisenhower Matrix. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, where you look at everything you do on a matrix of, is it urgent, high or low, or important, high or low? And based on how you assess it, then you take different actions. And the goal obviously is to just delete doing a lot of things or not focus on them, or to push them down to someone else if we can at least get someone to do them at 80% as well as we could. Oftentimes that is the tougher thing to do than just what do I do with the 90 minutes. But I think it leads to a little bit of what is, I find, to be probably the second biggest thing that is common, which is just the ability to delegate and coach and lead teams. Because there's so many people that the graduation from the doer to managing the doers to managing the managers of the doers is a really, really tough transition, because we're busy and we know that we can do something better than someone else, and there's too much empathy and they're not quite ready, so let me take it on, and all that doesn't serve them or doesn't serve the organization. And when I find that someone isn't leveraging their team as much as they could, either through feedback that I get from the team or through their own self-observation, the place I always start with is, tell me about your one-on-one meetings with your team. How frequently are they? What do you do from an agenda standpoint? And everyone initially has a really good answer, but when you actually ask them about what that looks like in practice, the one-on-one meetings with teams end up getting deprioritized and canceled more often than any other meeting on a leader's calendar. And I challenge people to actually reverse that model, that the most important meeting on a person's calendar is the one-on-one meeting with their team, because we know they're only going to be as successful as the people beneath them. And the best way to actually make them successful, build their capacity in developing them, is spending time with them that's dedicated, focused, prioritized around, how do we solve problems? How do I coach you? How do we actually remove obstacles from you? How do I help prioritize for you? And what I tell people is that a one-on-one meeting should never have any discussion around anything that could be shared through any other medium. The one-on-one should be uniquely about things that had to be discussed live. If you're giving me a report and walking through the sales numbers, not for the one-on-one meeting. That's for an email or some other session. This is literally about, I sent you an agenda the night before, sales are off. These are the 3 ideas I have. I want to talk through them with you. And then that becomes an opportunity for the leader to really test the direct report around how they're thinking about something, asking them probing questions, making sure they analyze it from a full 360 perspective. But it's also really valuable data for the leader, because if the leader thought that there should have been something in an employee's agenda and it's not there, then why is something not on the agenda that I would have expected the employee to have? What am I not sharing? What communication channels are broken down? Are they living too myopically focused on sort of one specific task? So the one-on-one meeting is full of data points that arm a leader to lead their team, but the most important purpose is to actually grow their team, and that happens through coaching, delegating, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a huge insight. Thank you for that. That's great. Okay. So I think everybody, I'm going to go back and listen to that like 3 times and change the way I'm doing meetings. So I think that was amazing. So that's at the level of the individual. And at the next level,
well, that was now leading the team. So
so
individual leading ourselves. How are we doing our reflection? Leading the team. Let's think about how do we coach and develop and delegate to our team differently. And then at the organizational level, I think I go back to the point you made about environments. And I love the word politics at this point, and politics is oftentimes a 4-letter word. And I often felt that way. The NFL, when I worked there, it's a political organization, and I don't say that in a negative or critical way. It is. If you think about what the NFL is, it's a governing bureaucracy that runs businesses and legislates rules on behalf of its 32 bosses. And its 32 bosses are both partners and competitors, depending upon what the issue is. If that's not a political environment, I don't know what one is. And so I lived in a world of politics without appreciating or wanting to be living in a world of politics. And I think that leaders, if they develop the political acumen, and it could be a C-suite dealing with peers, et cetera, but even at the CEO level, dealing with the board or dealing with other external stakeholders, or even with the people beneath them, the more you realize the game that's being played, incentives, how do you influence someone without always having the authority to doing it, how to know that you really need to negotiate on things, even if you're more right than wrong, to get someone's buy-in, that, flexing power has to be done prudently. How do you gain power, not just by dint of who you are in your office and your title, but gain power by becoming an expert or having people respect you? All those things are ways that we actually improve our political acumen that allow us to operate just better at scale. And messaging and storytelling are just critical to that, because trying to advance your agenda through sharing a story about something that happened at NBC, or advance an agenda around something negative you saw with a client or a competitor, all those are ways that fire up someone's ability to lean in and build an alliance with someone, and then start building a coalition, and again, advancing agendas internally. So political acumen and how to identify it and then use it to your advantage is something that's very, very common that we end up working with the leaders.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of what I do kind of more on the mentoring side, it is telling people, helping them learn how to tell stories, right? I mean, I spoke at a manufacturing conference last week, and it was a bunch of women. So I always loved kind of like, when you think of manufacturing, you don't often think of women. So these are women inside of manufacturing, where, that politics and how they get ahead is really important. And I actually went all the way back to my MDC, which you're gonna have to help me remember what that means. What was it, like management development?
Management development course, maybe somewhere.
Course,
You're going way back in the GE days there.
Way back in the GE days, I went. I did MDC, and we had one of the top GE HR talent leaders, talking to a group of women at one point and saying, "Let me just kind of break down for you how you really get ahead in this organization or any organization." And it's still the most profound career advice I've ever heard. I shared it with everyone at this conference, and it was the PI model: performance, image, and exposure. And people often don't know the right proportions of that. And the way I'll do my reveal. So hopefully if I go to a conference in the future, folks haven't watched this actual video, but it's that performance is 10%. Image is, I think it was 25%, and exposure is 65%.
Wow.
Performance, big 10%, because why? Because performance, it's the price of entry. You get to keep your job. Yes. Congratulations. Image, how you show up, right? Not just your clothing and stuff like that, but it's like, how are you showing up? But if nobody sees you, none of that actually matters, right? It's all about exposure. And so we kind of circle back to language. What I'm often kind of helping people understand is you have to learn how to tell stories, because it's how you build your exposure. And no amount of like checklists and like, here's all of the data on what I did this week or this month or this year. It's like, it's okay. But when you tell the story of how you did it and why it was important to do it and how you were at the center of kind of like helping bring that along, that kind of fires up the imagination. People are able to kind of put that into context, and so when you talk about political tools, like, I mean, I think it's like, learn storytelling, learn
Yeah.
the basics of being able to tell a story, and you'll bring plus there's all sorts of science. I mean, you release oxytocin when you tell a story, and so the other person is sort of starts to have an affinity with you, because they enter almost like a simulation. They're there with you. So when you can tell a story of how you got to success, it's like they walked with you, through that success, which gives them confidence that they can walk that path again with you.
Yes.
And so, I mean, I think that aspect of the political acumen that you talk about is so critical. But what do you do, Mike, when you've got someone I work with a lot of times with people in finance, people in science, R&D, who are like kind of really, or tech, or a little bit allergic, to, they want to lead with facts and all this stuff. Like, how do you help someone kind of understand that, you need to step back into your humanity I mean, we all know how to tell stories. For some reason, we think we don't know how to tell stories. We tell them all the time. Like, how do you help people do that?
Well, I think once you know yourself, it then allows you to then better know others when you come across them. Like we all know that, accountants are typically, left brain thinkers, marketers, salespeople, right brain thinkers. And, the story that you're going to tell that's going to really fire up Ginger is going to be very different than the story that you would tell that would really fire up Mike, the finance guy back in the day. But I think that if you prepare for the meetings you end up having, and we reference sort of having advice gathering or feedback meetings, that meeting can live side by side and have a dual purpose with being a political exposure meeting where you're telling a story, where you're asking them, how can you help? Oh, here's an example of how I helped somebody just like that. And that story gets tailored based on it's a salesperson versus a finance person in terms of what you're emphasizing or how you craft it. But having a way that you convey a story that's impactful and tight and memorable, oftentimes I think is a challenge for people, just because they're not used to it necessarily. Like I'm sure you've got a go-to playbook. One of them I've heard is this concept of a SOAR story, where the situation, the obstacle, the action you took, and the result. And I think, for people to have in their tool belt a list of 5 source stories that they're walking the hallways with, but that they can pull out when they need to, is something that is just critical at this day and age. And that is the same whether you're the CEO who just runs into a key customer at a restaurant, or you're a rising leader that just happens to be in the elevator with the CEO on the way up to the office. When you were saying the oxytocin kicking in of the story, it reminded me, one of my favorite quotes is this guy, Ed Sable, who started NFL Films down in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. And NFL Films, if people aren't familiar, is the high-end filmmaking version of what they see in the NFL. So if you see a slow motion football going into the end zone, or you see, a guy dripping in mud getting up off the field, chances are that's an NFL Films story. And he had this quote where he said, "Tell me a fact and I'll learn. Tell me a truth and I'll believe, but tell me a story and will live in my heart forever," which is just one of those things that I love it. And that's an example of a leader who used storytelling to actually have it permeate throughout his entire organization. So NFL Films is an organization of storytellers. They're an organization of rituals, of symbols. Everyone there would be able to tell you that they're the keepers of the flame in terms of what the NFL mythos should be. They've got weekly deeply rituals around how their product is produced and ultimately distributed. And not surprisingly, their employee engagement scores are off the charts relative to a lot of organizations because it's so clear what their purpose is, and all of their cultural elements are interwoven in terms of how they show up and what they do. And for them, it starts with storytelling. And people may say, well, of course it starts with storytelling. That's what NFL Films is about. You tell me an organization, and Ginger, I know you'd be the same way, pick a manufacturing organization. That can be an organization that's about storytelling. Like, the famous thing about, the janitor at NASA, what do you do here? I'm putting a man on the moon. Like that's the type of thing every organization should be thinking about themselves in a way that they know their own personal story and how it connects to the organizational narrative.
Amazing. I think you and I need to become like power duo, and we'll just, you'll shape the leaders and I'll help shape the stories.
Done.
It's awesome. So, okay, I've been firing like 1.5 million questions at you. I think we're close to our finishing time. But before we end, and the insights have been incredible, and the quotes, I'm going to be doing a bunch of pull quotes. Any questions, any lingering questions for me?
Well, we talked a little bit about sort of where I get started, or where the focus areas, and sort of I talked about this all 22 individual, team, organization, and sort of self-awareness. What are, like, if you said, okay, if the brand is, what are we doing here? I can't remember the exact words that you used. If the brand is, what are we doing here? What are the 3 things that you ultimately are questions you need answered in order to guide a client that way, or your 3 primary focus areas in order to unpack that or improve that?
Yeah, great questions. And I don't know how I'm 80%, 80 to 90% consistent in this answer. I think the first thing, and it's obvious but non-obvious, is, so it's sort of like, what are we up what are we up to around here? What's going on? And the first thing is it always goes back to the customer, the client. Like, who are we here for? People have a very generalized idea of who their customers or who their prospects are, but they haven't really gotten to know their stories. I mean, when we do work, I mean, we add in some, a lot of people take us up on it, and we regret when folks don't take us up on it. But like, just doing 10 to 12 customer interviews, like, I always tell people, like, it's just kind of a shortcut to the answers. They're going to tell you in natural language, what their frustrations are, kind of why they use you or don't, or, what parts of your product or service they get a high level of value from, and which ones are kind of like, little friction points, but really kind of thinking about who are we trying to serve. The second thing is, and again, it's obvious, non-obvious, is, you and all the other people that do what you do are kind of in the consideration set. So it's like, it's not just who do we serve, but it's like, well, you kind of have to look around. You have to look at the arena. Who's in the arena? Who's playing for that customer, and how are you different? I mean, so we think positioning is incredible. Like, sometimes it's a lost art. You really have to look at the entire landscape and try to see, where is that sweet spot of what people are looking for in general, where they're just, we always talk about incomplete buyers, but they're little incomplete. Like, all of the other guys don't quite deliver on this one thing that still is a source of frustration. And hopefully that intersects with something that you're really good at. And so finding your kind of white space in the market, this is kind of blue ocean strategy type thinking, but it's really important to look at the landscape, right? And then, and highly, highly important is, different is better than better. When we ask, clients, well, why should they pick you over these guys? Well, we're better at this, and we're better at that, and we're better at this. And they give us those logical answers. We're 10% faster and 20% more efficient, and whatever those happen to be. And the problem is that tends to be kind of a hamster wheel, because it's only going to take, a couple months before the other one can then be like, okay, well, now I'm better than you. And so we're constantly trying to find a point of difference. The thing that I think is, especially today, like in AI world, right? I mean, the thing that frustrates the crap out of me is like, everyone's like, oh, AI, I'm just going to have like AI do all my writing. Like I'll load, my persona or whatever. And what it has a hard time doing, unless you train it very carefully, and you still need to mind, it's a good helper, but you should be leading, right? It should be helping, not leading, is have a point of view, and that's often where the difference is. We work with, wealth management firms. You look at them, it's like they're 98% the same. The difference is going to be, what's their point of view? Where are they kind of drawing a line in the sand? Same thing with healthcare, same thing with tech and cybersecurity. It's like the difference really is what personality, what humanity, what point of view. Be opinionated. We're big believers in be opinionated, because I think that's how you can show your difference. So for us, it's like, who's the audience? Know them really well, have them tell you their stories, understand the story of the landscape overall and where you can fit into that landscape, and then try to exact your difference. And if you can get those things right, you're going to be 90% ahead of everybody else. And even the big guys, I mean, we've worked with, Fortune 100 companies, and even they sometimes, you revert back to the mean unless you're constantly, getting out there and kind of sharpening the saw and trying to like test. This is not something that you do once and you're done for, your entire career, because the landscape is changing and so are customers constantly. So it's like, you have to come back to it the same way you set your internal corporate goals annually, and then on a 5-year horizon, and perhaps even longer. It's like, you need to come back and just check what's changed. Have I changed? Have they changed? Has the landscape changed? What do I need to do about that?
Well, it sounds like there's a ton of corollary between what you do on the brand side and what I would tell a leader to do on the coaching side, because and it fits nicely in your pie model, where what image do they want? They want to be someone that's different. They want to be someone that's decisive. How do they know their performances or they're getting enough exposure? It's by collecting data from customers, so employees in one case, or actual customers in another case. What's interesting, and you spoke to it indirectly, what I've always sort of wondered is, when you talk to the customer, obviously, where's the space for innovation? Because the customer doesn't always know what it doesn't know. And I also always think about that when I work with leaders, around when you talk to the employees around what they want, or their peers what they want, where's the space for to create something new that no one else is thinking about, and that sometimes we have to pull that out, try to pull it out in conversation. How do you wrestle that down around real space for innovation that marries up being different and customers giving you their feedback?
Yeah, well, I mean, you and I could probably talk for a whole nother hour on just like, what is innovation, right? And
do you have a snappy definition like brand or culture?
I don't have, the short answer is it's different for everyone, but I think what people are looking for from innovation is leaps forward, not steps forward. Like, the one thing I could probably say is it's not incremental, right? You're really looking for kind of a step change in terms of like really going up to another level. And we're working with another client, a really big international media company, and it's been super interesting, because we said, hey, kind of give us your customer data. Like, we just want to look to see, like, are there any trends? What can we spot? I'll be perfectly honest. Every time we get a new client, I'm like 50% terrified. Like, we're not going to find like some insight that is like, that is really quality, but we trust our process. So we're asking for the data, and, we're getting a lot of usage data, but we're not getting like, I'm like, but what about the people? Like, what is it about them? And so we convinced them to do some research, just a poll. I mean, nothing fancy. It's like we had, 15 questions or so that we wanted to know. But what was interesting is if we had done interviews in this case, and we like to do both, right? Like, this was a client that had enough volume where, I mean, we got back like thousands of responses. So we could actually put together a good data set. But if we had asked individual viewers, why do they watch and what do they find good about this particular, channel, and, all of those questions, we may not have actually gotten to the answer. When we asked it at scale, so I'm coming back to your, like, sometimes they don't know, what the problem is or what they really want. What we ended up finding is there was this big theme about, the real reason they were watching some of these shows and to watch these channels is to stay connected to their people in another country. It was like this, so that they could have a virtual water cooler. They could be talking about the same things, kind of maintain connection. Like that just wouldn't have come up. And so, I think that when we're looking at how do we mine for insights, what we try to, you almost want to do it at the macro, and we've had it happen in interviews too, at the macro and the micro. In the macro, if you can get enough data, sometimes you spot a thread in there that no one at the company really pegged it, and no individual would peg it, but it was there, when you look at the whole thing. And other times, some tiny little anecdote squeaks out of a client. We had another one, great client in the manufacturing industry, and we were, we said, look, we want to talk to your people in the field, because we're trying to learn. It's like we don't really understand manufacturing, so it's like, let's talk to the people who actually are out in the field so we can try to gain some knowledge. And one guy ended up saying, and they're in the finishing industry. So for example, I'm trying to think, I mean, your microphone, my water bottle, things are coated, and there's a finish on them that sometimes, helps the paint stick or helps them not rust and all sorts of stuff. This is all chemistry, which I only knew in the last few years. But so we were trying to understand this, and a guy mentions offhand, well, the challenge is people can go to school to become a chemical engineer, but you can't go to school to become a paint line engineer, but you still need a set of skills, right? And, he was lamenting on the fact that, back in the day, there used to be real apprenticeships where someone was really teaching you on the factory floor, like how everything works. And you really attained a level of mastery, and that doesn't exist anymore. Well, we took that back and we're like, God, there's something there. And we ended up creating for this company, Paint Line University, for the entire industry, to have industry impact, because people still, the skilled labor is not going to go away. It's like, so people could come in and really learn the craft and start to elevate themselves, into mastery, at their factories and at their companies, et cetera. But it was just this little,
that
no one inside the company even really heard it, because it's like, yeah, that sucks, It's like, but we were able to hear it a little bit differently, kind of because we were ignorant in a way. And that's why I always like, I never shy away from being stupid, because I'm like, hey man, maybe I'll hear something that you wouldn't quite hear. But it ended up being a real kind of game changer for them.
Love that story. Love that story, because no one would ever come to you and say, yeah, we need a Paint Line University. That's not something that anyone would have ever thought about. Very cool. I love it. Yeah,
it's cool. Well, Mike, it has been an amazing conversation. It always is.
Same, definitely.
So how I'm gonna put how folks can reach you, et cetera, but why don't, just so folks kind of watching the video, how do folks kind of get in touch with you if they're ready to start to work on their leadership, ready for a coach?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn and website huddleadvisory.com. If you're a leader looking to think out loud about how do I become a better leadership athlete.
Love it. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Ginger. This was fun. Thanks so much.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.